Welcome, everyone. My name is Winnie Zhang, and I'm a National Call Team Lead here at People's Action. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm located in Boston, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples, past and present. I am honored to be your host tonight for our Stop Anti-Asian Hate teach-in during what is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We have an amazing program and incredible lineup of speakers tonight, so settle in. We're live on Crowdcast and also on YouTube and Facebook, so please join us wherever you can. We'll give folks a minute to get settled, but stay in the chat here on Crowdcast so we can talk to each other there. Before we dive into the rest of our program, I'm so excited to welcome, live from Chicago, singer-songwriter Narumi Tanagawa. Narumi is from Osaka, Japan, and is joined by pianist Isabella Isherwood to perform her song, Haze. Narumi and Isabella, take it away.
Thank you so much, Winnie. I'm so happy to be here tonight. I wrote this song Haze because I was just upset and in trouble by how many Asian people are affected and then hurt by all these hate crimes, yet seemed like no one was really talking about it around me. So I thought by writing this song and playing this in public, I can help other people to realize, wow, this is happening and I should do something. So please listen. This is called Haze. Keep your mouth shut. Don't be silly. Don't breathe. Did you get lost? What are you doing here? You don't look like us. You don't belong. You don't think like us. You are wrong. Go home, you fool. It's about time. This is no home for you. If you care and you feel that pain, you need to share. Hashtag retweet so people can see you care. You don't know who you are, but you know what they want to hear. They can change with them. It's just one click away. Give them the miracle they want to see. 'Cause truth doesn't matter anymore. Who am I? What am I? Feels like no one can ever hear me. Will I ever be enough to be seen? Will I ever be enough to matter? When will I get to be your trend? Oh, when will I get to be your trend? Where am I? Who am I? What am I? Feels like no one can ever hear me. Will I ever be enough to be seen? Will I ever be enough to matter? When will I get to be your trend? Oh, when will I get to be your trend? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Narumi and Isabella. That was incredible. And if you stick around, we've got more incredible music for you at the end of the program after we take action together to end anti-Asian hate. Tonight, we're here to reflect on the recent violence that the Asian American community has faced. During the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Asian rhetoric has fueled a rise in targeted violence and racism towards Asian Americans, particularly the elderly and women. I feared for my own safety in these past few months. Every time I step outside, no matter whether I'm at the store, out for a run, or even just taking out the trash, I make sure I'm wearing a mask, in part to keep safe from the virus, but also to keep safe from the virus of racism. I'm afraid that I'll invite violence towards myself if I don't wear a mask, that I'll be told to go back where I came from, that my people did this, that I'll be attacked physically. I felt heavy grief seeing countless videos of Asian elders being attacked on the street, and after learning of the shooting in Atlanta. I thought they could have been my grandparents, they could have been my sisters, they could have been me. And the thing is, while these incidents of violence are heightened now, the racism that our communities are confronting today is really nothing new. So tonight, we're going to be joined by incredible leaders in the movement who will take us through the history of anti-Asian racism in the US and abroad and what our vision for community safety looks like. This is our invitation to you to dream bigger about what we need to keep all of our communities safe. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, the amazing Emily Lee, Director of San Francisco Rising. Emily, take it away.
Thank you, Winnie. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Lee. I'm the Director of San Francisco Rising, and we are a multiracial alliance in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my pronouns are she and her. Like many Asian and Chinese American women who've grown up here in the United States, I've experienced my own share of verbal abuse and unwanted sexual attention growing up in California as a femme Asian woman. I remember being a child and hearing white people yell at my mom when they heard her speak English with an accent, go back where you came from, or kids taunting me with ching chong slurs in elementary school. So no matter how perfectly I spoke English, I was always an outsider, a foreigner. And at an early age, this really taught me to feel ashamed about who I was, embarrassed of my immigrant parents who didn't always understand American culture and what was right or wrong in America so that I could fit in. The funny part is I didn't even realize how deeply ingrained that this internalized racism was in me until I spent a year and a half living in Beijing, China to study Mandarin when I was 25 years old. For the first time, I could be part of the crowd, and as long as I didn't open my mouth to give it away, people just assumed I belonged and I grew up in China. No one ever stared at me. My black hair just blended into the masses of people taking the subway. And I finally felt safe in a way that I never felt growing up in the United States. I didn't need to walk into a room or a restaurant and do an unconscious racial scan to see how many Asians versus white people versus other people of color were present. There was no mental calculation of discriminated against because I'm Asian, because I am a woman. And although I've never been physically attacked because of my race or ethnicity, I know all of us in the Asian American community have experienced this type of mental exhaustion and fear because we can all imagine it happening. And we see it happening to our loved ones, our friends, our neighbors. Last year at the beginning of the pandemic, a good friend of mine who's in her 60s was shoved by an older white man as she waited in line at the local Starbucks in San Francisco. She almost fell, and as she turned to look at him, she said she saw the hate in his eyes. And, this incident just infuriates me because, the Starbucks barista kind of gave her, said, oh, your coffee's on the house, and escorted her outside. While, as she left the Starbucks, they were serving this man with a smile on their face. Why was she forced to leave? Why was this man's violence excused and implicitly accepted by the staff and the other customers? And there are too many examples of truly terrifying violent attacks on our Asian elders in San Francisco over the last year. And each one really serves to re-traumatize, re-trigger the fear, the anger, the outrage that we are all feeling. And yet we cannot live in that fear and anger perpetually. For the sake of our parents, our grandparents, and our children, we have to actually take action and imagine what does real safety for our community look like. And we also have to understand that this anti-Asian racism exists in a broader system where President Trump was also condoning violence against unarmed protesters, against Black men being killed every day by the police. And that's why I'm so grateful for People's Action for hosting this teach-in, because we can't create the path forward until we understand the roots of racism in this country. And in San Francisco, we are grappling every day with how to keep our community members safe in a way that doesn't further incarcerate Black and brown men or racially profile Black residents of Chinatown. So my friend who was attacked at Starbucks decided that the only way she could feel safe walking in her neighborhood again was to actually invite her neighbors to walk with her. So she created a walking buddy program where elders can request somebody to walk with them in the neighborhood. And this is how she feels safe leaving her house. Before that, she hadn't left her house for weeks because she was afraid to step outside and get pushed or shoved or yelled at by another white person. And there are community-based solutions out there, but we have to demonstrate that they are effective and viable at keeping us safe. And to me, that is the most important task before us as the Asian community standing together today, is for us to come up with our own solutions of what community safety and public safety looks like. That doesn't put our other communities of color at risk, but really is standing united with them in identifying these solutions. So I'm so excited for the opportunity to be here today. Can't wait to hear the rest of the speakers, and I'm going to pass it back to you, Winnie.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that powerful grounding. Your truth as a femme Asian woman is so needed and appreciated right now, because for so long, our experiences and stories have been written out of the books and out of the mainstream racial narratives. Anti-Asian racism is part of a long tradition of violence perpetrated by white supremacy and xenophobia and colonialism and so much more, which is why we're bringing our next speaker, Sandy Shan, to the stage. Sandy is an organizer with Justice is Global, a project of People's Action. And Sandy is going to help us retrace the origins of anti-Asian racism, both here and abroad. Sandy, please take it away.
Thank you, Winnie. Hi, everyone. This is Sandy. I'm with Justice is Global, a special project of People's Action. I'm organizing in the Pan-Asian diaspora around issues of progressive internationalism and have been working to shape the narratives around US-China relations to avert a new Cold War. Really happy to be here with everybody tonight. So these are the headlines that we saw on national as well as local news in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, as we talked about the surge of attacks against Asian Americans, we might have fallen into a trap. The rhetoric around these incidents tends to characterize the violence against Asian Americans as a new phenomenon, but in fact, it is nothing new. Violence against Asian Americans is embedded in the state, in policing, in immigration enforcement, and rooted in the legacy of dehumanizing people of Asian descent. Treating this violence as something new is a result of a systematic erasure of state-based anti-Asian racism from US history. And for me, a first-generation immigrant, learning the history of struggle and perseverance of generations of Asians, that collective experience of being the quote-unquote the other in this country. After slavery was formally abolished in the United States, thousands of Chinese migrants made their way to the US to seek better economic opportunities. Chinese laborers filled a need. They were hired for jobs communism, Asians ironically served as templates for the determination of attributes and recruiting mechanisms that made up desirable immigrants. The 1965 Immigration Act made visas available to qualified immigrants, which the act defined as those who are members of the professions or who have exceptional ability in the sciences or the arts. The act further defined acceptable professions as architects, engineers, lawyers, physicians, surgeons, and so forth, so that these undesirable immigrants are those that are unskilled and temporary laborers who are banned from immigrating to the US. In short, the 1965 Act only permitted people who already held a high socioeconomic status and education level in their countries of origin to immigrate to the US, which led to these images that we associate with people of Asian descent today. Asian whiz kids, for instance, and Asians above median education attainment and income levels. So the 1965 Act, in fact, created the model minority, and the creation of the model minority myth has significant negative consequences. It flattens the diverse Asian American population into a monolith, and is used as the issue driving the wedge between Asian and Black Americans. In addition to the model minority myth, another significant and persistent stereotype that constrains Asian Americans' identities and relationships with other people of color is perpetual foreigner. Asian Americans have been regularly scapegoated during periods of national duress. World War II saw the forced internment of about 120,000 Japanese Americans in the wake of attack on Pearl Harbor. After 9/11, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration 80,000 men and boys from predominantly Arab and Muslim countries were forced to register with federal agency. This program, which has not resulted in a single terrorism-related conviction, ended in 2011. But the underlying infrastructure remained as a tool by law enforcement to harass and racially profile Muslim Americans. And the nexus between the foreign threat and domestic policy often puts marginalized communities like Asian Americans at an extremely precarious place. But looking outward internationally, let's not forget that the US has consistently exported white supremacy through war, colonialism, and domination in the Asia-Pacific region, which has only amplified violence and racism against Asian Americans at home. In the insurrection of the Philippines against American colonial rule, 20,000 Filipino combatants were killed and more than 200,000 civilians died. During the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, estimated 105,000 Japanese people were killed. Audience can hear John Wayne, the narrator of 1951 documentary, This is Korea, in this scene shown here, exhorts a US soldier with a flamethrower to fry them out, burn them out, cook them. This them, in this case, are Korean people. And in the Oscar-winning documentary Hearts and Minds, the commander of American rations during the Vietnam War, William Westmoreland, famously said, "The Oriental doesn't put the same high price on life as does a Westerner. Life is plentiful. Life is cheap in the Orient." Even when the US is not directly involved in conflicts in the Asia-Pacific region, the colonial encounter between the US and Asia persists in the form of mass US military presence in the region. And this mass military presence is accompanied by the development of commercial sex zones to help make male troops happy. And it is at these stigmatized, the twilight zones, fetishization of Asian women and colonizing their body continues. One recent incident involves Jennifer Laude, a 26-year-old Filipina transgender sex worker who was killed by an American GI in the Philippines. But as soon as he was pronounced guilty, the United States intervened and shuffled him out of the courthouse. He was never imprisoned in the Philippines. I will end by saying this. What I discussed here today is just a snapshot of the racial bigotry people of Asian descent have faced for years. But recognizing the history of state-sanctioned racism against people of Asian descent is an important starting place needed to prevent further violence. Now I'm gonna pass it back to Winnie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. And if you'd like to learn more about Justice is Global and what Sandy just shared, follow the link in the chat and let us know in the comments too. What is something new that you just learned? And let's take a moment to let all of that soak in. What Sandy just shared with us is so important. I think about a quote from Dr. Jose Rizal, a Filipino revolutionary who was an inspiration to the movement for Philippine independence from Spanish colonial rule. He said, "A person who does not look back to where he came from would not be able to reach his destination." In order for us to move forward, we must acknowledge the past. And we know that the targeted racism and violence that the AAPI community has faced over this past year and more was fueled by a long history of anti-Asian racism, and it was further exacerbated by anti-China rhetoric during the COVID-19 pandemic. I am honored to introduce our next speaker, Toby Chow, Director of Justice is Global, a leading progressive voice on the connection between anti-Asian racism and the growing conflicts between the US and China to root us in the present day. Toby, it's all you.
Thanks, Winnie. So as Sandy has explained, anti-Asian racism has a long history here in the United States. But why is it flaring up so badly right now? Well, a lot of people put the blame on former President Trump, in particular his use of terms like Chinese virus and Kung flu last year. And I don't think this is the whole story, but it clearly did make a huge difference when Trump and Republican leaders started using that language. So, here's a photo of the notes for a speech that Trump gave in March of 2020, when that was when he first said Chinese virus out loud and on TV. And studies of social media have shown that as soon as Trump started doing this, there was racist language in social media posts about the pandemic. And a lot of the anti-Asian racism that we've seen since last year has involved comments that connect Asian people to the pandemic, calling Asians coronavirus or accusing us of being bat eaters or saying you're diseased or you caused COVID. But Trump is not the whole problem. Trump is now out of the White House and he's even off of Twitter. But if anything, anti-Asian racism seems to be getting even worse. So there's a problem here that goes beyond just Trump. And I think we need to see Trump as just one example in a broader trend in US politics and society. And that has to do with growing tensions between the United States and China. So here's a Washington Post article from this March after the Atlanta area spa shootings, which quotes Professor Russell Jung, who co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, which is a project to track incidents of anti-Asian racism. And Professor Jung says, when America China bashes, then Chinese get bashed. And so do those who look Chinese. Okay, so who looks Chinese? Well, as many of us of Asian descent know from experience, the vast majority of Americans are not good at distinguishing between different Asian ethnicities and nationalities. So in the eyes of most Americans, people who look Chinese can come from like 24 different countries in Asia. Okay, Professor Jung continues, quote, American foreign policy in Asia is American domestic policy for Asians, end quote. So there's a long history to this, but the rise today in anti-Asian racism is in part a product of growing China bashing in US politics. And that is something that goes beyond just Trump. Now, I think there are a lot of very valid criticisms of the Chinese government that we shouldn't shy away from. But there is a special kind of China bashing that we should really worry about that is feeding anti-Asian racism. And that's this growing trend where leaders in US politics will exaggerate and inflate the kind of threat that China poses to ordinary Americans. So for example, in this speech from last year, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo portrayed the threat of China in almost apocalyptic terms. He said, quote, if we bend the knee now to China, our children's children may be at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party, and securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time, end quote. So this is an extreme exaggeration. The Chinese government has no aspirations to take over the United States or anything like that. But it is now common to hear US politicians from both parties and other leading figures in the US say that China is an existential threat to us or a threat to the American way of life. And these are exaggerations, and they have consequences here in the US. So US politicians do this for a reason, and that's particularly true of Republicans and a lot of corporate-friendly Democrats. These politicians have been supporting policies that hurt the vast majority of Americans. Some of them have been doing this for decades. And it is very convenient for them if they can point to China and blame China for all the problems in the US, because that allows these politicians to avoid any criticism of how they have been hurting their own constituents. And then they can keep supporting policies that are bad for us. So, for example, last year, when Trump started saying Chinese virus, that was part of his effort to scapegoat China for his own catastrophic mishandling of the pandemic. When he started using that term in March of last year, he had spent the previous 6 weeks sitting on his hands and doing nothing to prepare the United States for the pandemic. And after that 6 weeks of just sitting on his hands, by mid-March, things were getting so bad that he had to recognize there was a problem, but he didn't want to take any responsibility for it. So he tried to put all the blame onto China. And he spent the rest of last year mismanaging the pandemic until hundreds of thousands of Americans were dead. And he kept scapegoating China so that he could get away with it more easily. China bashing was a big part of his election campaign, and he came scarily close to winning re-elections. Similarly, today, we have some Republican politicians saying that China is the biggest threat to American freedom and American democracy. At the same time, these same Republicans are spreading conspiracy theories about how Biden stole the election. They are working to pass laws that will prevent American citizens from voting in future elections. So American democracy, American freedom. But if they can keep voters thinking that the real threat to America is China, then that helps them get away with their project of destroying American democracy. And this is a big reason why we're seeing so much China bashing, especially on the right. And all of this feeds racism. Like Professor Zhang says, this China bashing means that Chinese people and anyone else who can be mistaken for being Chinese, we get bashed too. But it is not just Trump, and it is not just Republicans. Unfortunately, leading Democrats are also joining in on the China bashing. And one of the reasons is that they hope that they can rebuild bipartisanship with Republicans by pandering to this anti-China politics. But this is really dangerous. So one example, back in 2018, Christopher Wray, who Trump appointed as the director of the FBI, he said that China poses, quote, not just a whole of government threat, but a whole of society threat. He meant that every person of Chinese descent in the United States should be suspected of being a potential agent of the Chinese government and a threat to US national security. This statement was widely criticized by Asian American civil rights organizations, but Christopher Wray kept making these statements. And now, President Biden has kept him on as director of the FBI. So Christopher Wray still heads the FBI, and he is still making these statements, and the sentiment is spreading. Right now in the Senate, there is a bill called the Strategic Competition Act. It's being led by Democratic Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey, and that bill quotes Christopher Wray to justify programs which will, in effect, racially profile people from China, particularly students and academics. So we see Democrats are feeding into this too. And this kind of policy and rhetoric is feeding racism in everyday life. Some of the racist attacks against Asians since last year have involved accusations that people are Chinese government agents or Chinese spies. And I've experienced this myself on social media. There's a photo of graffiti that someone left on the door of the apartment of a Chinese international student in Houston, accusing her of being a spy just because she looks Chinese. This has become more common because top government officials like Christopher Wray and Senator Bob Menendez are saying things and promoting policies that feed racist suspicions that a random Chinese or Chinese-looking person could be a sinister agent of the Chinese government. And now, again, this is not to say that no one should ever criticize the Chinese government, but Representative Ilhan Omar, who's a real human rights champion, puts it well. She is deeply concerned about human rights, but she's also concerned about the kind of China bashing that she sees in DC. And she says, quote, "We need to distinguish between justified criticisms of the Chinese government's human rights record and a Cold War mentality that uses China as a scapegoat for our own domestic problems and demonizes Chinese Americans," end quote. And again, it is not just Chinese Americans, it is all of us who come from a wide range of countries who can be mistaken for being Chinese here in the United States. So in other words, we need to stop letting politicians play this trick on us. It lets them get away with bad policies and it feeds anti-Asian racism. Thanks. And Winnie, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Toby. As the daughter of Chinese immigrants, I've grown increasingly concerned about anti-China rhetoric and the rise in anti-Asian racism that it's fueled. As Toby just shared with us, in this past year alone, the racist rhetoric has fueled real violence against Asians in the US, such as the Atlanta spa shootings in March. In order for us to understand what led to that horrific event, we need to understand how race, class, and gender all factored in. And so I am incredibly proud to introduce our next speaker, Connie Nguyen, who is not only the amazing Healthcare for All director here at People's Action, but also the national chair of Affirm, an incredible transnational feminist organization engaging in anti-imperialist activism and dedicated to the fight against oppression in all of its forms. Connie, the stage is yours.
Wow, thanks, Winnie. So proud to be in solidarity with you. So tomorrow is an important day and cause for celebration. I'm sure many of you know it's Yuri Kochiyama's birthday tomorrow, which she shares with Malcolm X and other revolutionary heroes. So I wanted to lift her up and show her some love by sharing this quote: "The most powerful weapon for we women of color is truth. Go out and tell truth everywhere." So it is in that spirit that I am here today to tell some truth. And I'll be talking about the rise of anti-AAPI violence and the Atlanta spa shootings from an intersectional perspective. Knowledge of the incredible team of women and people who are making today's teach-in happen. It's abundantly clear that after the Atlanta shooting, just how much a deep analysis or understanding of anti-Asian racism is needed. I also want to acknowledge, the women of Affirm who fight for intersectional and transnational solutions as women of color. Much of my analysis should be credited to my sisters. So I just wanted to say that before I get started, because as we all know, dismantling structural racism alone won't dismantle patriarchy, right? And to achieve our collective liberation, we must oppose all oppressive systems. So to start, we have a sense of the rate of anti-AAPI incidents because of the data gathering and reporting of individuals through the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center. It's a project of the Asian Pacific Planning and Policy Council, Chinese for Affirmative Action, and the Asian American Studies Department of San Francisco State University. And this was created in direct response to the alarming rise and escalation of violence against AAPIs in the US, and it was launched in March of 2020, which was shortly after the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. So in just 1 year, there were 6,603 incidents of anti-Asian hate reported through this project. This includes assaults and also verbal harassment, shunning, civil rights violations, and online harassment. Gender, language, and religion are reported as major factors for violence, and the supermajority of incidents are reported by women. That's 65%. And according to the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, anti-Asian hate incidents are surging, actually. The rate of incidents has increased by 164% since this time last year. And the top 3 places where these are taking place are New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Perhaps one of the most memorable attacks of late was Vilma Kari, a 65-year-old Filipino immigrant woman, was walking down a street near Times Square when a man in broad daylight suddenly kicked her in her stomach. He continued to attack her and yelled, "You don't belong here." And as the violent scene unfolded, 3 men watched from the lobby of a nearby luxury apartment building. And when the woman struggled to stand up, one of the men, a security guard, closed the front door to the building. And Vilma suffered a broken pelvis. And most people probably already know when we refer to the Atlanta spa shootings, what we mean, but just as a reminder, on March 16th of this year, 21-year-old Aaron Long murdered 8 people in 2 Atlanta area massage businesses. 6 of those murdered were Asian women, and his stated motivation was to, quote, eliminate his temptations. The authorities have still not confirmed that these murders were racially motivated, and unfortunately, we never even expected them to acknowledge the misogyny inherent in the shooter's motives. That right there points to a prime example as to how the law does not serve our communities. There's a clear through line between race, class, and gender, but currently is not accounted for by the definition in the law. What conditions exist that lead to a large majority of anti-Asian violence to be targeted towards women? What conditions exist that lead one individual to murder 8 people to eliminate his temptations? Sandy and Toby have already talked about the long history of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia that's embedded in US settler colonialist culture. It's obvious to us, and that's why we're all here. But we also must pay attention to the gendered nature of these acts of violence. It's not coincidence that the vast majority of targets in these murders and acts of violence are women or feminized people, right? It's rooted in the fetishization of women of color. And I say women of color because we're all fetishized, but often for different reasons. For AAPI women, we're fetishized to fit the trope of a geisha, obedient, subservient, meek, existing at the pleasure and service of men or people with power. And for me, this meant that in college, I learned that people I'd never met already had ideas and racist imaginations about what my vagina was like. My disembodied vagina's reputation preceded me. And to others, that's all I was. So many people often think about a fetish as a kink. But what happens when you apply this kink to human beings? A fetish is the idea of sexual gratification from an object. And when you apply this to a human being based on their race, is dependent on a person's race, and the person is a racialized object. When we exist in the world of everyday life, these notions follow us, and so does the ideas that we are objects and not people, that we can be owned, exploited, and disposed of. What you're looking at is a review of a woman that works at the spa. This is not a review of her service as a masseuse or her labor. This is a review of her, the person, as a product. It is when human beings, in particular women, are viewed this way that one individual can go on a shooting spree for his own benefit, and that law enforcement can get away with miscategorizing the tragedies. That is how a person can walk up to another stranger and start attacking them in broad daylight, and how a security guard might decide it's well within reason to just shut the door on her. Another key factor in all of this are the conditions which lead to survivors and victims to the place they are when the violence happens. Know that there are decades of US foreign policy, colonization, and other factors that lead to economic destabilization in our home countries that have created patterns of migration from our homelands that bring women here. Once here, many API women are often left with precarious and low-wage work. There were economic factors that drove the women working at the spas to be in occupations that would expose them to gendered and sexualized violence. And all of this is part of the ongoing US imperial project. So we have to think about our solutions and reimagine them. Some of the solutions being offered are to increase policing budgets and increase policing. And that presents us with multiple barriers, right? The first one is that anti-Asian violence is not being classified as such. The second one is that law enforcement actually reinforces the system and order that creates the conditions for people to be divided, which is not only wrong, but dangerous and deadly. The third is that policing doesn't address the root causes of racism, misogyny, and economic exploitation. It creates a market for risky work under exploitative conditions. In fact, it won't even acknowledge the misogyny. And lastly, policing is preemptive. It doesn't prevent the violence. It wraps the violence, which has already taken place, in more violence. So we need solutions that don't reinforce the economic inequality and drive working people to compete against one another for the benefit of the wealthy elite. We need to understand these acts of violence from an intersectional perspective to help us refocus on our targets and re-envision our solutions. And we can't encourage the fetishization and commodification of Asian Pacific Islander women and expect to stop Asian hate. Fetishizing is the root of the violence. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Winnie.
Thank you so much, Connie, for helping us set the narrative straight. When we set the narrative straight, we see that the struggles that the AAPI community face today are rooted in these oppressive systems. And we see that our destinies are in fact intertwined with all of our Black, Brown, and Indigenous siblings, with the poor and working class, with all those who struggle for justice. So we are so lucky to be joined tonight by Asma El-Houni, Movement Politics Director at Rights and Democracy in New Hampshire, to talk about how we can build solidarity and move forward together. Asma, take it away.
Thank you so much, Winnie. Assalamu alaikum. I am honored to be here. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm here today with a heavy heart as Palestinians are being murdered by the settler colonial project of Israel. 220 Palestinians have been killed, 6,039 wounded. Just wanted to acknowledge and honor those lives. My heart is also heavy because our Black siblings in this country are still being killed with immunity. I'm here before you with a heavy heart because I know my Asian and Pacific Islander siblings are being targeted by an increase of hate. And I don't think we have ever really given you a chance in our movements to share your frustrations and your pain and your experiences. So I honor this as a sacred space that's happening now. I want to share a little bit about my community. I came to the United States 40 years ago, and I know I'm dating myself. I came from Libya, one of the countries that Trump has banned in the Muslim ban. And I can say I felt growing up, I felt racism, but I just wasn't able to name it as racism, like many community. I want to add that the majority of the Muslim community in the United States are either Black or South Asian. Also, the Black community has been telling us that, particularly the non-Black Muslim, to get on board with fighting against racism, right? And they clearly recognize we weren't exactly the in crowd. And for the most part, we didn't, right? Especially as immigrant Muslims get on board. Then 9/11 happened. And we found ourselves completely in the hot seat. We found ourselves targeted. We were the boogeyman now. And it was Muslim bashing season. And under this manufactured fear of Muslims, the United States created one of the most extensive surveillance programs in this country. There were no-fly lists, there were terrorist lists, and it created the Department of Homeland Security, including ICE, better known as Immigration's Customs Enforcement, which we all know is responsible for targeting and deporting brown and Black immigrants, right? What many people don't know, again, is the largest demographic of Muslims is the South Asian and the Black community. And as we talk about targeting of Asians and Pacific Islanders, it's important to understand many of the Muslims in our community that were targeted were South Asians and continue to be targeted as Muslims. We're talking about people who don't get due process when arrested, because when you're labeled a terrorist, you don't have the same rights as everyone else. So due process doesn't basically apply to them. So I have an example. About a year ago, a South Asian family contacted me and told me to help them organize because their loved one was arrested and was not told why. So not them, not the person jailed, not the family members, nobody knew why he was arrested, right? And there's also a lot of violence by everyday people. So we're talking about individual actors, right? Who literally learned to hate us. So as the hate crimes increased against my community, people started questioning security and how to keep ourselves safe, right? So we have an example in New York where the police department said they were really interested in protecting the Muslim community, right? And they wanted to foster trust, blah, blah, blah. And so they came to our places of worship, they came to our events, and basically we thought we were friends. We later find out they were keeping tabs on our community, keeping records of people they were engaging with under the guise of developing relationships, right, with our community. But what was really happening was this greater access to our community and the ability to target us even further if they choose to. So I share this to say that we have to really be careful not to address our issues through the security apparatus lens. Just like as a nation, we should not have been okay with the surveillance and the targeting by the FBI after 9/11, we should not be okay with using police, especially when we have communities like Black Lives Matter who've been organizing and trying to educate us on the harms of using police as a means of safety for our communities. The police, the military, the FBI are not making us safer. In fact, they are. They are the very things that are the most dangerous to our communities. It's state-sanctioned violence and racism that causes the individual actors to be racist against us. So going back to the Asian American Pacific Islander communities, we know that the United States has a legacy of racism, which by the way has always included anti-Asian racism. The Muslim ban is nothing new. We heard that the first restrictive immigration law in the United States banned Chinese women from coming, right? And what I hope we understand is this divide that is manufactured, literally created, that when you look at me, or when you look at our Asian siblings, or when you look at the Black community or the brown community and say those people over there are gonna hurt us, or those people over there are gonna rob us, them over there are tempting us, or they're job stealers and terrorists or drug dealers, right? They successfully have used fear, this kind of racism, to get us focused on hating each other and distracting us from what we need to focus on for our communities to thrive. So while they over there are hoarding wealth, they're handing kickbacks to the rich, they're defunding social services, they're threatening disability justice, they're harming our seniors, and then they turn around and point the finger and blame it on the poor families, the Black families, the Muslims, the South Asians, the immigrants, right? And then they have the audacity to convince us that they will save us from our fears, right? And that we need the security apparatus like the police to protect us. Literally, they've bamboozled white folks who are scared of us and us, people of color who think we need protection from the racist individual actors that they've created. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. And please understand, the reason we're jailing more and more people is oftentimes well-intentioned people like us who keep relying on this system and thinking we just need to make this criminal justice system better, right? 5% of the population, the United States is 5% of the population, but holds 25% of the people in prison and jail worldwide. Y'all, we are failing miserably. And we're not failing as a people, we're failing as a system that relies on punitive measures. So I don't want you thinking that there aren't things being done. Recently, 72 Asian organizations in the Bay Area issued this awesome statement, quote, "As organizations with a long history of protecting and advancing the rights of communities of color, we know that an over-reliance on law enforcement approaches has largely been ineffective and has been disproportionately harmful to Black communities and other communities of color. We believe the solutions to a violence is to empower our communities with resources, supports, and education. This is how we make all our communities safe," end quote. So I'll end with this. To my Asian and Pacific Islander siblings, we see you, we love you, and may we walk together with you and understand that this fear basing, targeting is harming everyone, including our white siblings who just haven't fully made the connections that they too are being harmed by this system that's trying to divide all of us. So let's get free together. Assalamu alaikum. Back to you, Winnie.
Thank you so much, Asma. It's so clear that we can't win our collective safety without all of us joining together. And that is why I'm so excited to introduce our next speaker, who will share with us what it will take to keep all of us safe. Councilmember Nelsie Yang of St. Paul, Minnesota, is the youngest and first Hmong American woman elected to the St. Paul City Council. She is co-governing alongside people, labor unions, and organizations to build toward a society united across race, class, and gender, where working families live lives that are long, fulfilled, and joyful. Please join me in welcoming Councilmember Nelsie Yang. Councilmember Yang, please take it away.
Thank you, Winnie, and hello to fellow organizers, leaders, and comrades all across the country. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Stopping anti-Asian hate is very personal to me. One, because I'm a Hmong and Asian American woman and know that I am the direct target of anti-Asian hate. Second, I worry about the safety of my refugee parents who speak English as their second language. That worry comes directly from knowing that we live in a society not built to protect people of color, refugees, and working class people like my parents. Third, I represent a heavy working class community in which over half of our residents are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, with over a third identifying as Asian or Pacific Islander. Our largest Asian ethnic population is Hmong. During this pandemic, our API community has been the most racially targeted group by other communities because of how the media and elected officials and so much more portray the virus. And to this day, I can't bear waking up to another traumatic, high-profile case on social media nor in the news in which APIs, especially elders, women, and our youth, and API-owned businesses are the target of violence and destruction. I'm extremely grateful for this space hosted by People's Action because these atrocities cannot continue, and not by anyone, no matter whether you're white, Black, brown, no exceptions at all. To API folks, I want you to know that it's okay to cry, to feel hurt, angry, and betrayed. I feel all of that too. These feelings are also my reminder that there's still so much work to do. We need to be united more than ever to fight the systemic racism and oppression, intentionally working to divide our communities. The same divide that pushes communities of color to see each other as enemies as we fight for scraps. Every day when we wake up, we must make the choice to fight for racial, social, and gender justice. We must reject the ways in which the systems we live in work only for the few, while the rest of us are barely scraping by. And let me tell you why that's so important for all of us to remember. We are always told that we don't have enough money nor resources to support the people who are hurting the most in our communities. This scarcity mentality is the biggest lie we've ever been told by a system that's rooted in white supremacy, especially our own government that to date invests an absurd amount to police all of our communities, resulting in the over-militarization that we see in our local communities today, the criminalization of poverty, the mass incarceration of Black people, especially Black men, the war on drugs, and separation of generations of families through our bloody immigration system. Even worse, decision makers who do all of this without ever asking what we need, justify over-policing and militarization by using the excuse of anti-Asian hate and the same anti-Black hate, which resulted in a police officer murdering George Floyd in May 2020, then Dante Wright just a year after that in Minnesota, sparking thousands of people-led protests throughout this country to demand racial justice and an end to police brutality. I'm here today because I refuse to let our hurt and pain be used as pawns to benefit white supremacy. I know you're here because you've been hurt and you feel the same as I do too. We need to redream safety in our communities because we can and we deserve so much more. This is exactly why I'm a part of a national movement to defund the police and ensure that those dollars are reallocated to community safety solutions rooted in people, social services, mental health, education, and address the root causes of the poverty and racial disparities we face. One person alone cannot make this dream a reality, but through the collective of a multiracial, multi-generational movement, we can do it. So today I invite all of you to be a part of this fight. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Yang, thank you so much. It is time for us to dream bigger about our vision for safety. From Boston to St. Paul, Minnesota, from Minnesota to Palestine, we know what our communities need to be safe. We know that more policing and state-sanctioned force do not keep our communities safe. So that's why here at People's Action, we're throwing down with our comrades in Minneapolis, the center of the defund movement last summer, to fight for solutions that invest in our communities instead of what harms us. I'd next like to introduce my colleague and dear friend, Susmik Lama, to let us know how we can get involved. Susmik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Winnie. My name is Susmik. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the national call team managers with People's Action, and I'm calling from Manchester, New Hampshire, undocumented ancestral land. I'm a 1.5 generation Nepali immigrant. I moved to the States when I was young, and I cannot tell you how many times I've had folks shout, "Go back to your country." Those words would pierce my heart, shatter my self-confidence, and silence my voice. Those words would make me question if I truly belonged here. My accent is not American enough. Food I eat every single day has this lingering curry smell that gives me away. And my religious and cultural holidays do not align with the American holidays. It took me more than a decade to finally stand up for my identity as a Nepali American, to embrace that there is no such thing as American enough. And if someone were to tell me to go back to my country today, I have the courage to stand up and say, I am home. I am home, but am I safe? I am aware of the privilege I hold in this country because of my naturalized citizenship. But I'm not a stranger to the fear undocumented immigrants hold while they're working menial jobs that do not pay minimum wage with no access to healthcare or any other benefits or services for that matter. I'm not a stranger to the deportation of immigrants and refugees in this country and how deeply traumatic these experiences can be. My childhood best friend was deported twice. The trauma my friend experienced still has a crippling effect whenever this topic comes up in our conversation. I am not a stranger to how the law enforcement has been the primary perpetrators of violence in so many cases. Stratford County Jail, here in New Hampshire, is under a contract with ICE and currently house 80 detained immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, and there are thousands more detained across the country. So safety does not mean more law enforcement engagement and heavy policing in our communities, but safety for our community means access to healthcare, mental and racial healing, guaranteed housing, justice, and freedom to live. None of us are free until all of us are free, and that includes our Asian American Pacific Islanders, Black, Brown, Indigenous, elderly, disabled, LGBTQI, immigrant communities here at home, and also Palestinians fighting against the white supremacist violence perpetrated by the US-funded Israeli occupation forces. Our liberation and safety is tied to all the oppressed people here at home and across the world. Which is why, as an Asian American, I am deeply invested in the work that's moving in Minneapolis, Minnesota to win the Charter Amendment, led by a coalition of Black and grassroots organizations following the murder of George Floyd last summer that sparked a global uprising against police brutality. If this amendment gets passed, the charter would provide alternate public safety options that puts the needs of our community at the center and takes a step in the right direction to address the root causes of systemic racism that we have been talking about tonight. And if we can win in Minneapolis, the center of anti-racist and Black Lives Matter movement right now, we can begin to transform and heal our communities across the country. You and I have an opportunity to transform the community and write a new history together. With so many amazing and powerful speakers and all of you joining us here, I feel grounded. And most importantly, I feel seen in this moment. And I am ready to take action. Who's ready to take action with me? Let's see it in the chat, folks. Who here is ready to reimagine what safety means for our community, recreate a world where we stop violence and repair the hurts and harm that has been done unto our community? Let's address the root causes of hate, harassment, and the structural racism that we face and stand in solidarity for our collective liberation here and across the world. Let's recreate history together. Can you join us in the fight for our collective liberation and to keep our community safe? Can we count on you to make deep canvas phone calls into Minnesota this Sunday, June 6th, 3 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time? Please click on the link our chat moderators are posting in the chat and sign up to make calls. And for our API folks who are on this call tonight, we see you, we hear you, and we feel your pain. Please join us in People's Action's first API cohort meeting on June 13th. Please click the link our chat moderators are posting in the chat. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and I look forward to meeting you all soon. Back to you, Winnie.
Thank you, Susmik. Who here is excited to phone bank with us? We want to see every single one of you joining us in solidarity on June 6th. And so much extra gratitude and emojis in the chat to all of our powerful speakers who shared their stories and narratives with us tonight, and to you, our audience, for learning with us to not only stop anti-Asian hate, but to fight racism and white supremacy in all of its forms, and to reimagining a safer world for all of us. It was my honor to be your host tonight, and I hope to see you all soon. And now I'd like to introduce you to our final performer of the night. She's been winning singing competitions since the early age of 10 and appeared as a fabulous vocalist on the hit TV show Empire, closing out our teach-in with a classic cover by the Youngbloods, Get Together. Please join me in welcoming Chinese-American producer and singer-songwriter from Chicago. Light it up in the chat, y'all. Let's give it up for Kiki Shu. Take it away, Kiki.
Everybody, if you know this song, please sing along with me. Love is but a song we sing. Fear the way we'll die. You can make the mountains ring or make the angels cry. Though the bird is on the wing and you may not know why. Come on, people now, smile on your brother. Everybody get together, try to love one another right now. Some may come and some may go. We will surely pass. When the one was here returns for us at last. We are but the moment, sunlight fading in the grass. Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now. Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now.
Thank you for having me here. I'm so grateful that I can do something for Asian community. And thank you for being here and support Asian community. I truly appreciate it. Let's get together and send out a message to the world. Stop Asian hate. We don't need hate. And love can always fight everything.
Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now, right now. Ooh, if you hear the song I sing, you will understand. Listen. You hold a key to love and fear, all in your trembling hand. Just one key unlocks them both. Is there at your command?